It was October 31st, Halloween. At the time, my parents were still together and hadn't divorced yet, so my siblings and I spent the holiday together. However, in our family, we had a rule that split us up. Half of us went with my mom, and the other half with my dad. I have 5 siblings, but my youngest sister hadn't been born yet, so it was just the 4 of us. My sister, who's about 3 years younger than me, and I went with my dad, while my younger brother and other sister went with my mom. My dad had planned for us to go trick-or-treating in a different neighborhood where the houses were bigger. I called up a few friends to see if anyone could join us. Most couldn't make it, but one friend, Aubrey, said she could. So, my dad picked her up from her house, and we headed to a big, fancy neighborhood full of beautifully decorated homes. Aubrey and I wandered around on our own while my dad stayed with my sister. I was bursting with energy and would sometimes dash ahead, leaving Aubrey behind because I was eager to hit as many houses as possible and collect a ton of candy before Halloween ended. Halfway through the night, Aubrey and I found ourselves in a quieter area with no other kids around. We were just talking about school, some drama with our friends, and what we planned to do with all the candy we collected. Normal, random stuff. About 7 minutes later, we heard this strange scraping noise, like something being dragged along the ground. It was loud enough to grab our attention. When we turned around, we saw someone dressed as a creepy clown, holding a bat, slowly walking toward us. We were standing in the middle of the street, and even though we didn't know what was happening, we both started feeling uneasy. I've always been scared of clowns, so I quickly began walking faster, with Aubrey right behind me. The street was eerily quiet, and we realized we had wandered pretty far from the other kids, which made things even more unsettling. We kept glancing back at the clown, and after about 30 seconds, he just stopped walking and stood there, staring at us. We decided to head back and find my dad, but when we looked back again, the clown suddenly started sprinting toward us at full speed. We bolted, screaming, and ran as fast as we could, not even caring where we were going. The street was steep and quiet, similar to the back roads near my old apartments, with hardly anyone around. The clown was shouting as he chased us, and although I didn't dare look back, Aubrey later told me he had raised his bat like he was about to hit us. Our hearts were pounding as we rounded a corner and reached a street we recognized. We darted across the road without even paying attention to the traffic, just desperate to get away. Then, suddenly, it all went quiet. The screaming stopped, and when we glanced back, the clown was gone. He wasn't behind us anymore. After running for a while, we eventually found my dad and told him everything. He believed us right away because we were both crying and screaming, and being only 13 at the time, the fear on our faces was enough proof that something had really frightened us. Now, clowns are my biggest fear, and I doubt that will ever change. Aubrey and I still talk about that night sometimes. It left a lasting mark on both of us. Looking back, maybe the clown was just a teenager messing around, trying to scare kids, but whatever the reason, it was terrifying. What a creep. Throughout my life, I've experienced strange and paranormal things, seeing shadows, ghosts, and hearing disembodied voices. These occurrences were so common to me that I didn't think much of them. They became just interesting stories to share and quirky facts about myself. But in the fall of 2009, when I was 15, something happened that changed everything. I was invited to my first and only Halloween party, and what took place that night left a deep impression on me. My friend invited me and 6 other girls to her Halloween party, and her younger sister invited some of her own friends as well. We went trick-or-treating, but nothing particularly exciting happened. We bumped into a few boys from school, exchanged a quick hello, and moved on. Once we got back to the house, the older girls, including me, went to my friend's room to relax, while the younger ones went to her sister's room to trade candy and take off their costumes. After everyone settled down, we all gathered outside in the yard. The younger girls played on the swing set while the older girls stood near the deck chatting. I started feeling cold and a bit uneasy in the dark, so I decided to go inside with another girl. We had just stepped through the doorway when we suddenly heard a loud scream. One of the younger girls came running inside, panicked. My friend's sister followed closely behind, along with the other younger girls. We all retreated to my friend's room, sitting together and unsure what to do next. After a while, someone asked my friend to check on the younger girl who had screamed. When my friend returned, she was frantic. She rushed over to me, looking scared, and told me I needed to come with her right away. Before I could ask why, she pulled me out of the room. At the top of the stairs, she explained that since I had some experience with paranormal things and was the oldest, she thought I was the best person to help. The younger girl was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled up, crying into her arms. Her whole body was trembling, and I could hear her soft sobs. I sat down across from her and gently touched her arm. She looked up at me, visibly relieved. She explained that while she was on the swing, facing the woods, she started to feel strange and uneasy. She jumped off the swing and stood at the edge of the woods. Her sister had asked if she was okay, but she told her to stay quiet. Then, she said she heard a low growling sound and asked if her sister heard it too, but she didn't. Feeling both curious and scared, she took a closer look into the woods and saw two bright red eyes staring back at her. The growling got louder, sending chills down her spine, and that's when she screamed and ran back inside. I reassured her, telling her I had also felt uneasy near the woods earlier, which is why I came inside. We talked about ways to calm her down, and I suggested calling her grandmother to pick her up. While she waited, the rest of us tried to relax by watching TV, but something still felt off. Later, I went to check on her and found her sitting under a window facing the front yard. She looked sad, and when I asked if she was okay, she said she had seen a figure standing on the street with the same bright red eyes she had seen in the woods. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I glanced outside but only saw a car pulling into the driveway. My friend's dad walked her out to meet her grandmother, offering comforting words before they left. Even though I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, it lingered. At around 2 a.m., I woke up and needed to use the bathroom. Another girl was also awake and needed to go, so I headed upstairs while she went downstairs. As I passed through the living room, I felt an odd pull toward the window, as if something was calling me. The room had large windows overlooking the backyard, and when I looked out, I was hit with a wave of fear. There, at the edge of the woods, stood a shadowy figure with bright red eyes and what looked like ram-like horns. Terrified, I ran downstairs as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached my friend's room. I sat on the floor, trying to make sense of what I had seen before eventually falling asleep. By morning, we all agreed not to talk about what had happened to the younger girl, but I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my mind. It played on repeat in my thoughts. Later, the group decided to go into the woods to investigate, but I stayed behind with another girl, a family friend I'd known for years. Being with her made me feel a little safer, so I told her everything that had happened. We agreed to check in with the younger girl at school the following week. In the weeks after the party, I grew closer to the younger girl, and we often talked about that night. We felt curious and started researching to see if we could find answers about what we had seen. We looked online and asked friends if they had experienced anything similar, but after a while, we became overwhelmed and confused by all the different theories. Then, one day at the library, one of the boys we had run into on Halloween overheard us talking. He apologized for eavesdropping but said he had seen the same thing that night. We all sat down and pieced it together. The younger girl had seen the figure at 10 p.m., the boy saw it at midnight, and I saw it at 2 a.m. It seemed like the figure revealed itself to us in 2-hour intervals, starting with the youngest and ending with the oldest. The boy and I had known each other from school for years but had never really talked, and we had both just met the younger girl that night. Over time, I lost touch with the boy after a falling out, but I still occasionally talked to the girl. We've stayed close, even though we don't see each other as often. To this day, I still wonder what exactly we saw that night and why it appeared to all of us. This happened on Halloween in 2015, when I was around 13. I was technically too old for trick-or-treating, but my friends and I decided to go anyway. Since we lived in a safe neighborhood, we didn't need our parents with us. There was a row of houses that always went all out with their decorations each year. Usually, they looked like something out of Pirates of the Caribbean, but that year, the themes were all based on different horror movies. One house stood out, though. It didn't have as many decorations, and the lights were off. This house was supposed to be themed after the Jason movies, featuring the guy with the mask. However, all they had was a man outside pretending to trim bushes with a fake chainsaw. I recognized the house since I knew the girl who lived there, and I figured the man was her older brother, who I had heard about but never met. He was a senior in college, and it seemed like the kind of creepy stunt he'd pull on Halloween. The guy would rev the chainsaw near the bushes and laugh as he moved around, giving off a weird vibe. But it was Halloween, so I figured it was all part of the fun. As my friends and I were leaving the house across the street, the guy suddenly stopped what he was doing and stared at us. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it definitely creeped us out. It wasn't the playful kind of scared either. Just then, a big group of people came out of the house behind us, and I lost sight of him in the crowd. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again, but this time on a different street. It was around 10:45, and my friends and I were getting ready to head home. We split up, and I began walking home alone. As I walked, I started feeling uneasy, like something wasn't right. When I turned around, I saw the man with the chainsaw standing next to some people about 6 houses behind me, on the opposite side of the street. I tried not to let it bother me, but the strange feeling didn't go away. I passed a few more houses, but that uneasy sensation kept growing. When I glanced back again, he was only 3 houses behind me, this time on my side of the street. I picked up the pace, and being the clueless 13-year-old I was, I decided to cut through a few backyards to try and lose him. Panic started to set in, and I broke into a run. I didn't need to turn around to know he was chasing me, I could hear him coming. I jumped back onto the sidewalk, hoping to find someone nearby, but there was no one around. At that point, I was really scared. Realizing I couldn't outrun a grown man, I made the choice to stop and face him. I stood still, and he did the same. We were standing there, about 2 houses apart, just staring at each other. Then, he started the chainsaw and held it next to a bush, pretending to trim it. That's when I realized it wasn't a toy, it was a real chainsaw with an actual chain on it. I screamed as loud as I could, and thankfully, the lights in nearby houses came on. Seeing the lights, he quickly turned and ran off. I didn't waste any time, I sprinted all the way home and vowed never to go trick-or-treating again. Later on, I talked to my friend who lived at that house. I wanted to tell her how scared I was and how her brother had taken things way too far by chasing me. But when I told her what had happened, she looked confused. She then explained that her brother had been in Oregon, at OSU, the entire time. About 12 years ago, when I was around 16, I lived in a small town. One Saturday night, around midnight, I was driving my friend home after we'd spent the evening together. My friend lived way out in the countryside, and to get there, I had to drive through long, winding roads with no street lights or houses, just trees and open fields on either side. I always disliked dropping her off at night because the drive back made me feel uneasy. It was so dark, and the road felt desolate. Maybe it was because I'd watched too many horror movies, but I couldn't stop imagining all the bad things that could happen out in the middle of nowhere. But it was my turn to drive, so I didn't have much choice. After I dropped her off, I was extra cautious. It wasn't just my nerves getting to me, I was also aware of the possibility of running into drunk drivers who might not handle the curves well. I turned left onto the last small road before reaching the main highway. This road had two large curves that you had to take slowly because they were wide and came one right after the other. As I approached the first curve, I slowed down and noticed three people dressed entirely in black walking in the middle of the road, blocking the entire lane. At first, it was hard to see them because of their dark clothing, and I was frustrated, thinking they were just careless teenagers not considering how dangerous it was to walk in the road at night. I didn't want to stay behind them for too long, so I sped up a little to pass them by switching to the other lane, hoping no car was coming from the opposite direction. As I drove past, I glanced out my side window, expecting to see some regular teenagers, but what I saw made my heart skip a beat. All three of them were wearing creepy gray skull masks, and they stared right at me as I passed. If it had been near Halloween, I might have brushed it off as people getting into the spooky spirit. But this happened in May, which made the whole situation feel off. What struck me as even more unusual was that they didn't seem like they were trying to force me off the road, they hadn't even looked back when I first drove up behind them. The whole thing was so strange that I decided to call the police and report it. Not long after, the police called me back and said they'd sent an officer to the exact location I had described. However, when the officer arrived, they didn't find anyone walking on the road or even off to the side. What really unnerved me was that there was nowhere for the three people to hide. The area was completely open, with empty fields on both sides and no trees or bushes in sight. There were no side streets they could have turned onto to disappear. It made me wonder how they could have just vanished like that. Maybe someone had picked them up, but either way, I know for sure that what I saw were real people, not something I imagined. To this day, I have no idea what those three masked people were doing there, but I told my friend that if she ever wanted me to drop her off again, it would have to be before dark.